Rarity let out a squeal of fear as the chains around her legs started to pull her down towards the wedge underneath her, until she was basically sitting on top of it, legs on either side. It wasn't at all that uncomfortable at first, but the chains kept pulling harder and harder, and soon the wood was pressing into her quite painfully. The chains around her forelegs seemed to gradually loosen up, but that was all the good news that had to be said. "You comfortable? Have everything you need?" Cheerilee asked, mockingly, as she re-emerged from the shadows. "You can answer with no, or literally anything else." Rarity screamed, and attempting to plead for her life, but totally failing to do so. "All right, good. Seeing how you're getting it on with that dragon and all, I figured you were one for a bit of interracial action. And from the way you're riding that donkey, I can see I wasn't mistaken," Cheerilee said as she drew near. "I don't think it'll be long at all before you've connected at a deeper level." What remained of Rarity's face contorted with pain as the wooden donkey continued to press into her skin. In an effort to relieve some of the pressure, she tried to press down against the wedge with her forelegs, but that did not prove easy. Her hooves simply slipped off if she tried to put them on the sloped sides, so she put them right on the top instead. Despite that, she wasn't able to completely negate the chain's pull, and the wedge broke her skin, sliding into her flesh bit by bit. Rarity screamed as her blood started to trickle down and drip to the ground, pushing down with her hooves even harder. Her forelegs shook under the effort, but the wedge didn't sink into her any deeper, so she continued to give it her all. The pressure continued to rise, and slowly but surely her hooves started to crack. But still, she did not give in. Twilight was still out there somewhere, so every minute she managed to hold on. Exhaustion finally started to take its toll, and Rarity found that her legs were no longer able to keep up with the increasingly great downwards force. Its pull overtook her from one moment to the other, and the wedge slid through her soft flesh, tearing her apart. The agony made Rarity let out a series of gurgling noises, and the bleeding was now no longer a trickle, but more of a stream. The wedge came to a stop against her pelvis, grinding against the bone. "That time of the month, eh?" Cheerilee said, with a sadistic smile. She'd always thought Rarity looked down upon the earth ponies of Ponyville, so it was extremely satisfying to finally be able to put the unicorn in her place, once and for all. The fear of death gave Rarity a sudden rush of adrenaline, and she redoubled her efforts to keep the donkey at bay. But it was a battle she simply couldn't win. By now, the forces pulling down upon her were absolutely massive, and she wasn't able to push herself up again. It didn't keep her from trying. Her hooves finally couldn't bear the abuse anymore, and they shattered, almost simultaneously, tiny fragments of bone digging themselves into the enormous sensitive flesh that lay just beyond. Rarity screamed and drew back, her hooves reflexively, and, in that instance, she sealed her fate. The full force of the chains made short work of her pelvis's brave resistance, and the wedge shattered right through it. Rarity screamed as her reproductive organs and parts of her intestines were torn apart, and the donkey crashed into yet another bone. The wedge seemed loath to give up its newfound momentum, however, and the bone instantly started to chip, the wedge driving itself deeper and deeper into it. Rarity let out a high-pitched, choking scream, and then, one moment later, it was all over. The wedge broke through the bone and shot straight up, shredding her innards and breaking through everything foolish enough to get in its way, before finally cleaving right through her shoulder. Cheerilee relished Rarity's dumbfounded expression as blood flew everywhere, painting both ceiling and floor, and, naturally, splattering all over Cheerilee as well. The two halves of the unicorn's body fell to the ground, one on each side, where they rejoined the blood and various other bodily fluids that had flew from her body earlier. Cheerilee licked her lips, and was pleased to note that the unicorn's blood didn't taste any bit more fabulous or ladylike than any she had tasted before. She sighed happily, like one would on a sunny summer day. She just couldn't overstate her satisfaction. "Huge success," she said, with a blissful smile. The wall finally swung open. Twilight had found exactly what she had been looking for, but sadly, it had been hidden just as cleverly as she had feared. There wasn't any visual distinction between the secret buttons and the stones that surrounded them at all, so she assumed Cheerilee had them all memorized. She was impressed, despite herself. Amongst her friends, Rarity probably had the eye for detail required for things like this, but her rather limited field of interests worked against her. Twilight couldn't say her memory was anything remarkable, either. For Cheerilee to be capable of a feat like this, she dashed into the inner sanctum, and was relieved to find only one path open to her. That made it a lot easier. She could have searched the entire area, of course, but she knew she was running out of time. She didn't know exactly what Cheerilee had lined up for her friends, but it couldn't be anything good. After all, she was likely the one behind the theater fire as well. The unicorn followed the twisting hallways around every turn, galloping as fast as she could. It didn't take her long to arrive at the staircase, at all, and there she made a startling discovery. "Oh, Celestia! Spike!" She ran over to his side, dropping down next to him and examining his wounds. She instantly spotted the stab wound in his chest, and her blood froze in her veins. There was no way any pony could survive a stab wound straight through the heart without medical care, even if he happened to be no pony at all, but a dragon. "Oh, Spike," she whispered, as tears filled her eyes, and she drew the dragon's limp body into a shaky embrace. "Twilight," Spike said, as he opened his eyes slowly, against all expectations. "Spike!" Twilight yelled out in pure happiness and joy. I thought you... How?" He grinned at her smugly, if a bit weakly. "Dragons have their hearts on the other side," he said, as he patted the right side of his chest. "I just passed out from shock and blood loss," he thought, but he didn't want to worry her by saying it aloud. There was nothing she could do right now. Rarity is... and all the others." The unicorn looked at Spike's tormented face, and tears running down his cheeks, and she instantly knew what he was trying to say. She felt sick, and if she'd been standing up, she'd probably have been swaying on her hooves. How do you... she asked carefully. Cheerilee told me about them, and then I woke up briefly and heard the screams." They remained silent for a moment, not knowing what to say. Or rather, they both knew that there was nothing to say. Their friends were dead. Or, well, their condition was uncertain at best. Twilight wouldn't allow herself to believe anything Cheerilee said, before confirming it with her own eyes. There was but one way to save every pony who was left, no matter if that was just the two of them, or some of the others as well. And they were both aware of the odds. Running wouldn't help now, not when Cheerilee knew the entire fortress inside and out. I have to take out Cheerilee," Twilight said, almost surprised to hear herself say it. I know. Go. I'd just hold you back. I'll rest here," Spike said, with some effort. Twilight nodded, reluctantly. She wasn't stupid. She knew it was her best shot, their only shot. But she didn't have to like it. More than anything, she just wanted to curl up in a ball and cry. But she knew she'd lose everything if she had left if she did. "I'll be back for you, I promise," she said as she stood up and dashed up the stairs as quickly as she could, to prevent herself from changing her mind. Tears stung up in her eyes, but she had work to do. "I know," Spike said weakly, as he took out a parchment, the ink and quills he had always carried with him. No pony even knew where he kept them, and no pony ever asked. It was kind of like a silent mutual agreement. He didn't ask where they all kept their bits, and they didn't ask him about the parchment, ink, or quill. It worked. He rolled around and put the parchment on the floor, dripping the quill into the ink as he started scrambling to write with a shaky hand, black spots swarming in front of his eyes. He couldn't think straight, so he just kept it as concise as possible, fearing he didn't have enough energy for a longer message. "Ruins in Everfree. Every pony else is dead. Twy went after Cheerilee. Send help." He had barely finished writing the last sentence when he lost all feeling in his fingers, and the quill simply slipped out from between them. He took a deep breath, as he could manage, and spit out a pitiful flame. He'd never produced a flame this small in his life, but it was sufficient. As it fed upon the paper and quickly empowered itself, the princess would get his letter. He smiled. Rarity had been his crush, but he had known Twilight his entire life. It had felt wrong to leave without seeing her one last time, but now he felt at peace. He was at his limit, and he couldn't hold on any longer. He closed his eyes and quietly passed away, content, knowing that, because of him, help was on the way. Twilight rushed up the stairs, but she came to an abrupt halt upon entering the room which lay beyond. Cheerilee hadn't bothered to clean up after herself, so Rarity's bloody remains were still on display. Twilight felt her knees go weak as she supported herself against the wall as her stomach emptied itself all over the floor. "Cheerilee," she whispered through clenched teeth. "I'll make you pay for what you've done." She breathed in and out deeply, slowly regaining her composure. A door on the other side of the room seemed to be the only other exit besides the stairway she had just climbed. So Twilight assumed Cheerilee had escaped in that direction. There was no way to be sure, though, as there was probably plenty of secret passages around this area. She slowly walked to the other side of the room, averting her eyes from the grisly scene in the middle, and pushed open the door. A dark hallway lay beyond, which didn't seem to have any distinct features to speak of. Twilight entered it only hesitantly, fully aware of the fact that it could easily be another trap. But then, what else could she do? Anything but a straight rush towards the finish was clearly in Cheerilee's favor, as Twilight couldn't really prepare against a possible attack, while Cheerilee had plenty of things she could spend preparation time on. She started the gallop, her eyes zooming from left to right, but nothing happened. She reached yet another door without incident, and took a deep breath. She had a feeling she already knew what lay beyond. "Welcome, Twilight," Cheerilee said as the purple unicorn entered the room. "Why don't you lie down and get comfortable?" Twilight looked around and found the room to be mostly featureless. It was circular in shape and empty apart from a table in the middle with a chair the opposite side, which Cheerilee was sitting in. The table had 2 metal cuffs at both ends, and their intended purpose was clear. "No thanks," the purple unicorn said. Cheerilee sighed. "We both know you can't win, Twy. Why fight fate any longer? Your end will be the same. Twilight pointed at her adversary. I see Spike managed to get one on you. I can't let him beat me now, can I? The fuchsia-colored mare gritted her teeth and leaned forwards. She didn't want to be reminded of that. Enough words. Cheerilee surged forward, bumping over the table elegantly as she charged straight for the unicorn, who braced herself. Twilight managed to jump out of the way from the first punch, but the second one hit her straight in the face, and she staggered backwards. In truth, she was severely outmatched, as Cheerilee had her beat both in strength and experience. She could only rely on her sharp wits, but as Cheerilee wasn't unintelligible either, it didn't really do her much good. Twilight retaliated, but Cheerilee dodged her with ease. Give it up, Twi, she taunted, as she jumped from side to side. You unicorns may pretend to be the superior race, but we're playing by Earth Pony rules now. Twilight backed away, creating a momentary lull in the fighting. I can handle myself without magic just fine. Cheerilee sneered as she started to circle her opponent. Last winter wrap-up suggests differently. The unicorn charged forward, her head lowered, lining up her horn with her opponent. If she couldn't use it for spells, she could at least try to gore with it, right? But such an attack was far too direct to have a chance of success against Cheerilee, who simply stepped aside and lifted one of her hooves. Twilight tripped and rolled over the floor, coming to a sudden stop as she crashed into the table in the middle of the room. She scrambled to her hooves, but Cheerilee was immediately upon her once more, delivering blow upon blow all over Twilight's body. The unicorn could do nothing but weakly raise her forelegs in an attempt to protect herself, as Cheerilee raged on, unabated. Suddenly, Twilight saw her chance, and she gripped both of Cheerilee's forelegs with her own, struggling for control. You're the reason. All your friends are dead, you know, Cheerilee said with a grunt, as she slowly forced back Twilight's hooves. I refuse to believe they're dead, Twilight said stubbornly, fighting on despite the bleakness of the situation. Cheerilee grinned, and suddenly threw all of her weight on just Twilight's right forehoof, pushing her aside and slamming it down upon the table. She rammed her head against Twilight's at the same time, and the purple mare saw stars floating around her head. That brief moment of dizziness was all Cheerilee needed to slip one of the cuffs around Twilight's forelegs, and she jumped back triumphantly, panting slightly. Twilight was out of breath, and her foreleg was twisted into a rather awkward angle, which caused her a great deal of discomfort. You've lost, Cheerilee said triumphantly. No, I can still fight, Twilight said louder than needed, obviously trying to talk some confidence into herself. Cheerilee was clearly unimpressed, and she moved in again, easily ducking under Twilight's amateurish jabs. The teacher lunged forward and wrapped both of her forelegs around Twilight's chest, bear-hugging her tightly. The unicorn let out some choking sounds as she started to feebly hit Cheerilee's back with her free hoof, but it was largely ineffectual. The teacher simply lifted her up and slammed her down upon the table, thoroughly knocking the wind out of her and dazing her for a few seconds. That was all Cheerilee needed to put both cuffs on the unicorn's hind legs as well, and with that, the fight was pretty much over. More bark than bite, just like that annoying pet of yours. Twilight struggled against her bonds, trying to free her right forehoof with her left, but without a key, she'd never succeed. You'll never get away with this, Cheerilee. Some pony will notice we're gone, and then they'll come after you. Cheerilee laughed. You mean to say you've told any pony about me? Twilight remained silent. They hadn't actually known Cheerilee was behind Twilight Twist's abduction. And at the same time, she had thought that there was no time to delay, so they hadn't actually told any pony much of anything. But my friends will... Your friends are dead, Twilight. Cheerilee roughly interrupted her. You're the last living soul in his entire fortress, besides me. All the others died by my hooves. I don't believe you, Twilight yelled. Why should I believe you? You're just trying to trick me into... Cheerilee suddenly grabbed Twilight's left foreleg and forced it down towards one of the iron cuffs as well. Twilight wasn't in any position to resist by this point, and her weak, "No, wait," didn't sway Cheerilee either. You want proof? I've got proof, Cheerilee said with a smile as she reached underneath the table, revealing the jar she'd been moving around all this time. The jar was smeared with blood on every side, but it was easy enough to make out the individual contents. She shook the jar in front of Twilight's face. Applejack's honest tongue, a piece of Rainbow Dash's loyal heart, Pinkie Pie's smiling lips, and Rarity's eye for fashion. I'm afraid I wasn't able to retrieve a piece of Fluttershy. No, that can't be, Twilight said as shakily as she shook her head, tears appearing in the corners of her eyes as the color flushed from her face. You're lying. Those aren't... Cheerilee put the jar on the edge of the table as she climbed up, pressing her body down against Twilight's as she softly started to stroke the unicorn's mane. Oh, Twilight, she said gently, that brain of yours is your biggest selling point. Don't insult yourself by clinging onto irrational hopes. You know I wouldn't simply happen to be carrying around a jar of pony bits. But why? Twilight said softly, as her voice broke and tears started to stream from her eyes. What did we ever do to you? We? Not just you, Twilight. Just you. You brought Canterlot's corruption to this town. You corrupted my students, your friends. All of them, Cheerilee said, suddenly angry. You made them all weeds, and weeds are cast out, Twilight. And I am the only one who can. I'm the only one who can keep Ponyville clean from the weeds like you. Twilight whimpered, making herself as small as she could while shaking all over. Cheerilee's voice had gradually become louder and louder during her rant, to the point where she was basically shouting at Twilight at the end. But you know, Twilight, Cheerilee whispered into her ear, I know you, too, are a victim in the end. You're intelligent, kind, but even you got caught up in the web of lies and deceit in the end. Twilight was surprised by the gentle tone in Cheerilee's voice, but she was even more surprised when the mare suddenly locked lips to hers, kissing her deeply, pressing her body against hers. Cheerilee kept it up for well over a minute, and Twilight's brain melted in her head, unable to figure out what the buck to do. Cheerilee finally disconnected her lips from Twilight's again, and panted, her cheeks flushed with a deep shade of purple. Twilight felt both bewildered and embarrassed, not sure what to make of the entire situation, but feeling more than a little violated. Why did you... A sharp mind gets me going, Cheerilee said with a sly grin. And was that your first kiss, Twilight? Twilight's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, despite herself, and she turned her head away, unwilling or unable to reply. Cheerilee grinned lasciviously, having gotten all the answers she needed. "Well, I'm afraid we still have business to conclude," Cheerilee said, with the closest thing to regret she was capable of. "I can't let you go unpunished, Twilight. But I'll make it quick." No, wait! If you let me go, I swear I won't tell any pony," Twilight said, as she burst into tears again. "Please, don't kill me! Please!" Don't worry, Twilight," Cheerilee said, as she tapped the jar next to her. "Your friends are here for you. Although," she said ponderously, "perhaps they could be a little closer." She opened the jar and held it in one hoof, and then suddenly stomped the unicorn in the side without warning. Gah! Cheerilee jammed the jar into Twilight's now open mouth, emptying the contents inside of her. Twilight gagged and tried to spit them out again, but Cheerilee was prepared for that. She threw the jar aside, shattering it on the floor, and pushed her hoof up against Twilight's chin and lips, rendering her unable to open her mouth. All she managed to do was make some blood dribble out of the corners of her mouth. But that was pretty much it. She started to go green as she felt her friend's body parts roll over her tongue, and her efforts to spit them up grew increasingly desperate. "You're going to want to chew," Cheerilee said, with her classroom voice. "Else you're going to choke." Twilight gingerly started to move her teeth up and down, as her gag reflex started to make her feel as if she was choking already. Pony teeth weren't really designed for meat, but they still managed to cut Applejack's tongue and Rainbow Dash's piece of heart into smaller bits, crushing them into a bloody paste. Rarity's eye got caught between Twilight's teeth as well, and promptly burst open, releasing the inner eye fluids into her mouth. This finally proved too much for the unicorn, and she tried to hurl, but nothing came up, as she already emptied her stomach earlier. All it did was hurt her throat, which reinforced the feeling of choking even more. She started to swallow reflexively, downing a little bit of the mouthful each time, until eventually her mouth was empty. She felt about ready to die. "All gone?" Cheerilee said gleefully. "Good girl." She finally let go of the unicorn, and Twilight immediately rolled her head to the side and started to spit, trying to get the horrible taste out of her mouth, her insides feeling as if someone had tied a knot in her intestines. Cheerilee left her to it, as she slipped off the table and walked over to the chair, retrieving the knife that she held there. She returned to the middle and climbed onto Twilight's again, who was now sobbing quietly, apparently broken by her ordeal. "Look at me," Cheerilee said, in a neutral tone of voice, only to scream, "Look at me!" when the unicorn didn't respond right away. Twilight shakily focused her gaze upon Cheerilee, tears cascading down her face. The fuchsia-colored mare smiled and looked down into the unicorn's eyes as she caressed her cheek. "It's time," she said, as she rammed the knife into Twilight's side, hot blood dripping down the side of the table. The unicorn's eyes widened, and she let out a choked scream. Cheerilee stabbed her again and again, until her victim was bleeding out faster than a gutted pig. "Shh, shh," Cheerilee soothed Twilight. "It'll be over soon now. I don't want to die," the unicorn said weakly, as the color drained from her face and her breathing became troubled. Cheerilee put her lips right next to Twilight's ear and whispered, "Your last breath. Give it to me." She pushed her lips over Twilight's again, and forced her tongue into the unicorn's mouth, relishing the lingering taste of blood within. This time, Twilight wasn't as taken aback as before, but she was way too weak to resist. Although she did struggle against her bonds weakly. Cheerilee started to shake with excitement, and she felt the other mare's body grow colder and colder, and her struggling weaker and weaker. By contrast, the teacher's kiss grew more passionate by the second, and pretty soon she was panting into the unicorn's mouth, while Twilight's breathing grew shallow and labored. Finally, the unicorn breathed out one last time with a final, delicate, muffled cry, and then all her bodily functions ceased. Cheerilee broke off the kiss, as she literally felt Twilight's body go still underneath her own, and a wave of excitement overtook her senses. She clamped her legs around Twilight as she felt them turn to jelly, her whole body shuddering and shaking, momentarily rooting her in place as she panted, breathing in and out raggedly. She threw her head back and let out a moan, before collapsing onto Twilight in a heap, feeling thoroughly worn out, even though she had barely undertaken any action. She continued lying there for a while, catching her breath, basking in the afterglow of her victory. She eventually slid off the table, taking a few unsteady steps on her wobbly legs, as she started heading towards the exit. Her work was finally done, and her quest had come to an end. It hadn't been a pretty job, but some pony had to do it, right? And if she happened to have made it a little more enjoyable here and there, who could blame her? She'd have to lie low for now. Wait for yet another investigation to blow over, probably. There were no ties to her this time, though, so she supposed she'd be all right. Ponies were used to her spending holidays at home during the school year, so her alibi wasn't much of a bother. Ponyville was safe now, and that was great. But she suddenly wondered if she wouldn't start to long for some more weeds to exterminate after a while. She smiled. There was always the cancer lot.